do. Sarah, I'm delighted to welcome you. This is a stunning book. I read, I think, the first 93 pages at the end of a day of teaching, just straight off. It was absolutely fascinating. I wondered, I know that many people will have read reviews and so on, but could you just begin by telling us about the book from your perspective, please?
Thanks, Selina, and thanks very much for inviting me here. I see the book as being in three parts. The first part is about the politicians who have tried over the years to make use of Mumsnet. So they perceive Mumsnet to be a place where they can access key floating voters, particularly middle-class women. And so they go on Mumsnet, particularly during elections, whether that's a general election, Lord Mayor election, or the Scottish referendum. And they go on to try and persuade the women who use Mumsnet to vote for them or to support their particular policies. The second part is about the way in which Mumsnet, the sort of the official Mumsnet, has been able to parlay that influence into political support for its various campaigns. And some of those campaigns have been about things like better miscarriage care. There have also been campaigns about libel reform because, you know, as an internet site, Mumsnet has run into problems. But there's also been what you would call perhaps feminist campaigns, such as We Believe You. And then the third part of the book talks about the way in Mumsnet has become what I describe as a safe space for women with gender critical views who have been chased off so much of the internet, particularly Facebook and Twitter. And they have found this space on Mumsnet, which really does stick to as much as it can to a principle of free speech. And so women have been able to go onto Mumsnet and both discuss their opinions about issues such as the Gender Reform Act, but not just to talk, but also then to gather together to act in various different ways. And I position Mumsnet as part of this resurgence of gender and women's rights activism that we have seen in Britain over the last sort of 5 years. So I see it very, very much as being symbiotic with organisations such as Women's Place UK, but other organisations as well, like Filia and Fair Play to Women.
I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that, because I think there's a lovely term that you use. Is it cooperative constellations? Could you say a bit more? Because one of the things that really excited me about the book was thinking, wow, Mumsnet is such a force in its own right. But then as you're hinting at there, you're drawing this kind of idea that it's part of a bigger network and it's enabling women to network together.
Yeah, I came across this idea of cooperative constellations. They're also called velvet triangles. It's research that's been done by women mainly in Scandinavia from the 1980s onwards, looking at the way in which, well, first of all, Norwegian women, and then also women in the EU have gathered together to campaign for policy change. And they talk about these different constellations of women coming together. So it's women journalists, women politicians, women policymakers, women activists, and just the woman on the street. And they say that, you know, you need this collaborative coalition of women to get policy change. And of course, this is quite interesting when we're talking about in the terms of things like the Gender Recognition Act, because in fact, it's this cooperative constellation of women who are in fact saying, whoa, can we talk about some of the implications for policy change? So it's slightly different, but I do think that we can apply that around that subtopic, but also other topics. So for example, in Scotland, around the sort of the proposed hate crime bill.
That's really interesting. And within Mumsnet, I think we often are told about social media that we're all existing in a bubble, whether it's Twitter or Mumsnet or some other form. Did you get that impression in Mumsnet? Is it quite siloed? Or, for example, do you see women changing their minds or refining their opinions about things?
What I like about Mumsnet is the sheer appetite for research. And that's not just about, you know, gender critical issues, it's about anything. Mumsnetters will go out and what I like to think of them as being almost like citizen journalists, but they're citizen archivists. And they go all over the place and they'll bring back an article from some San Francisco newspaper or something they found on an Iraqi Twitter site or something else that they found in a government white paper, and they will gather it all together and they will discuss and debate it. So I think, yes, I mean, mean, we all are in our bubbles, and it does take a lot to change people's minds. But I have seen it happen on Mumsnet just because of the sheer amount of information and research that they share. You do get people going, oh, well, I didn't think this to start with, but after a couple of years of being on here, I've really changed my mind. So yes, that does happen.
And as you mentioned, these women are kind of coming on to Mumsnet, and you have some great lines in the book about, is it a quote from one of the Mumsnets that says, "Came for the baby, stayed for the feminism."
Yeah.
So tell us first, what was your own journey with Mumsnet? Because I'm right in saying, aren't I, that you are or you were a Mumsnetter?
Oh yeah, no, I am a Mumsnetter. I went on Mumsnet 19 years ago, so I've nearly been there from the beginning. And I went on there because a colleague at work, I was pregnant, we were both pregnant, and she said, oh, if you go on this new site called Mumsnet, they will send you an email, I think it was once a month, where they will tell you what's going on with your fetus. So I went on there just to sign up for this email, and then I discovered the discussion threads, and that was it. I was absolutely hooked, and I was just on there all the time. And as I say in the book, the reason I do research on Mumsnet is that my head of department at the time kept coming into my office, and I was sitting there always on Mumsnet. And eventually I said to him, I'm writing a conference paper. That's what I'm doing on this. I'm doing research, because, you know, I couldn't tell him actually I was looking for a surefire way of keeping a toddler in his cot. So he was like, oh yeah, okay, yes, you're in media studies, that works. And so that's where my research, but also my life on Mumsnet has continued. So yes, I'm still a user.
That's fabulous. And how does it work with Mumsnet? Did you have to get in touch with Mumsnet Towers, Mumsnet HQ to get the okay for doing this kind of research?
They know I do research. I've done a whole variety of different types of research, mostly qualitative and analysing discussion. But the Mumsnet have in the past, they've allowed me to go on and run surveys. And they've also allowed me to go on and run kind of discussion threads about a particular topic I was interested in. So they have been really, really supportive of my research. I have to admit, I was really worried when the book came out, because, I did tell them that it was coming out, but they have been so sweet, and they even invited me on last week on a Zoom chat, and they sent me some really nice chocolate brownies as well. So to say
are they your favourite biscuit? Because people always ask on Mumsnet, don't they? What's your favourite biscuit?
Yes, I did have to talk about ginger and chocolate biscuits and how they're my favourite biscuit. Yeah.
But no, chocolate brownies isn't bad. That's fantastic.
Oh,
and
cool.
how did you go about doing it? Because one of the things that struck me about the book is it's so readable, because it's not overlong, it's not a huge tome. And so I must admit, when I picked it up, I thought, oh, Sarah's going to have maybe done some case studies of maybe 5 or 6 users or something. But you've amassed this kind of wealth of material. So have you sort of known for the last 10 years or so that this is what you're going to be writing on? Because as you said in your introduction, you're ranging far and wide across different threads and so on. I mean, I'm aware of the feminist boards, but like you say, the politicians' chats and so on took you into different parts of the site.
Yeah, no, it's been ticking away in my head for some time, but seriously, Selina, do not underestimate the amount of time I spend on there. And so, when I come across a thread that I'm really interested in, or I think, oh, this is interesting, I bookmark it. So yeah, I just spent the time going back over all those bookmarks. But the bulk of the first part of the book is the 100 web chats that they did with politicians, which I read so nobody else has to. And that was actually really interesting, because I was asked the other day, who is the politician who has gone down the best with Mumsnetters, who they really, really thought was really good at answering questions and engaging with them? And the answer is Michael Gove.
Wow.
Michael Gove went down brilliant, and I think it's because he's a journalist, and he was just able to type quickly and in a really quite, I mean, when you were reading it, you were like, oh yeah, he's great. And I'm like, what am I doing? But, yeah, he really went down well.
That's really interesting. Do you get the impression that any of the politicians who go on Mumsnet are changed by the experience? Does it either change their mind on what they think they have to prioritise? Because you make the point in the book that we're always being told about the woman's vote, and particularly the floating woman voter. Or is it more a kind of PR stunt? Well, I've been on Mumsnet, that's it, move on.
I think for the majority of politicians, when you're reading it, you almost get really angry with them because they're using it to broadcast rather than, as the internet is, to have a dialogue. They're not doing that. They're on there because they've got this particular thing they want to push, and that's what they want to talk about. But there are a couple of politicians that really do stand out as having engaged, but also having picked up what women feel strongly about. So a lot of the legislation and guidelines that the government have brought in around miscarriage care have been stated to have come from those chats, and the sort of the real passion that the women talking about what had happened to them to politicians, not one individual, but it's come up several times. And I think as far as things like the Gender Recognition Act is concerned, I think at least it gave politicians pause. They suddenly realized there is a very, very strong strength of feeling here. And although I don't really want to discuss this issue, I can see that it is perhaps not as straightforward as I thought it would be.
Yeah, because you make the point that the women are sort of coming on a lot and asking repeatedly about that question. And what struck me, and I mean, it didn't surprise me, but it was sort of disheartening, is how often, as you say, politicians just, we're wanting to bat it away, not answer the question, however often it came up.
I think it's a political hot potato for them. And so it was really obvious after the first couple of web chats where it was coming up a lot, that the politicians had decided that the best way to deal with it was to have a prepared statement, and that would be sort of placed as their first answer. And then they'd say, okay, now I've made that statement, I'm going to move on and address some of the other questions. But the questions just kept coming up and up again and again. So there weren't really any politicians who could handle it properly, which was a big problem. They didn't want to discuss it. They didn't want to go on record saying anything. And so it just was something that they wanted to ignore. And that was the problem, because it was like this enormous elephant in the room that they were just trying to tiptoe around, and they were really cherry picking the questions. There's this one question that I can answer, so I'm going to spend a long time answering that question.
That's so interesting. I mean, I found it really powerful, your statement in the book where you say, this is a group of women who tend to vote, who tend to think of themselves as engaged politically, but in the end, they just felt like very often there was just no political party that was representing.
Yeah, I talk a lot about in the book about how women on Mumsnet in particular, there's an enormous feeling of homelessness, that I think I would be right in saying that Mumsnet tends to be centre or left. And they have always relied on organisations such as the Labour Party, the SNP, the Liberal Party, the Green Party. That has been their political home. And they've always supported organisations such as the BBC or the Guardian. These are organisations that always think like them. And then on this particular issue, they've gone to political parties, they've gone to trade unions, they've gone to the Guardian, and they've said, we have some issues here. Can we ask questions? Can we raise this? And they have been absolutely horrified to be told, no, go away. You are transphobic. It was an awful thing. Be kind. And now they feel really homeless. And there are some individual politicians that they like and admire because they've spoken on this. But that's where we get the organization of all these new women's rights groups that have grown up, because women have nowhere else to go. And so they've had to invent something for themselves.
And like you're saying there, it's a political hot potato. Of course, it's also the issue of gender recognition and everything that comes from that, a hot potato in our neck of the woods in universities, for publishers, as Suzanne Moore's case has shown, in the media as well. So how's it been for you researching it? Did you meet any obstacles?
Yes, I have to say, when the book came out, there was a listserv. I'm a media studies person, and there's a listserv that a lot of media studies academics are part of, probably thousands all around the world. And the book was announced on there, and it was described immediately by somebody as, oh, this must be transphobic garbage. And then there was a kind of an outburst of how hateful I must be. And that this was an awful book, and actually the book and I should not be allowed on the listserv. And somebody sort of who runs the listserv sort of said, well, instead of criticizing, perhaps you could review it and then criticize it, genuinely and legitimately. But instead, sort of, there was a lot of, I wouldn't touch this book. There's no way I'm going to read it, and that's, I think, as an academic, one expects people to be able to argue, to be able to look at both sides of an argument, to tell you with evidence what is wrong with your position. And instead just to be told you shouldn't be researching Mumsnet because it's transphobic, and you in fact by doing that are being transphobic, was quite shocking for someone who believes in academic debate. And I was invited at first to write a blog for an academic blog, and then after 10 days, because of this, I was told that it was too inflammatory. So I'm like at this, so I'm writing about sort of a website aimed at parents, and I'm being told that that's too inflammatory. And I'm researching the fact that this is a website that has 10 million monthly users. This is a lot of women that go on this website, and as part of this wider resurgence of women's rights in the UK, something has changed. A government has changed what it was going to do. And shouldn't we, as researchers, say, well, this is really interesting, what's been going on here? Let's go and investigate this website and find out what they've been doing. But apparently we're not supposed to do that.
So interesting. And of course, as you make the point, there is a diversity of views within Mumsnet, including on this issue. And I think one of the things that you really draw out is the fact that there is a debate that goes on there.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a debate. There are people who come on, and Mumsnet comes on and says, look, on this site, there are not just gender critical women, but there are also women whose children in particular are trans, and we are here for parents, and we are here to support everybody. So there is debate, just as there are on political issues as well. So the fact is that people are talking to each other on Mumsnet, and I think that that is really, really important, and it's one of the only places, I mean, things have changed. You can have discussions on places like Twitter to a certain extent now, although they're still closing it down. But at one point, Mumsnet was really the only place on social media where these discussions and debates and interactions could take place. So I think it's been a really important part of the whole discussion.
Well, I'm really glad that you've written the book, and I can see that we're already getting some questions in. So begin with a couple, sticking on that point about Mumsnet as themselves. So one questioner asks, what about the class character of Mumsnet users? I know that there are a few people in the chat as well who are quite struck by your saying that Michael Gove was so popular. So is it, I mean, I guess the stereotype is this is a bunch of middle class, wealthy women, Southeast England. Is that fair?
No, I don't think it's fair. I think that Mumsnet has come from everywhere, including out with the UK, but they are from all classes. What I think is that this stereotype, however, is sold to the advertisers. So you get kind of Waitrose and Feather Down Farms and that kind of aspirational product being advertised around Mumsnet. And the politicians definitely think that this is a place to access the middle class woman who is this floating voter, who apparently does not make her mind up until actually a general election is actually sort of almost, about to occur. So this is why you go on there at that point. But no, what's amazing about Mumsnet is that it has women from all over the world using it, because there is no other place like Mumsnet. I know, I've looked. But it's also, and I would admit that there's between 2 and 5% of the users are male as well. So you do get even men going on Mumsnet. It's not just for parents. I mean, it says it is by parents for parents, but there's a very, very large percentage now of the women who use it don't have children, or their children are, older, grown up, left home or whatever. So people are drawn there, perhaps for the parenting tips, came for the babies, but then they stay for the, the really intelligent and entertaining discussion that goes on there.
That's just amazing. Oh, it's interesting as well what you say about women staying on once their children have grown up or they're getting older, because we've also got a question about the age profile of Mumsnet users and relating to this idea that we believe, I think there's some quite good data on the fact that younger people think differently about gender recognition to older people. Is that reflected among the women on Mumsnet, or is it difficult to tell?
It is difficult to tell, but I think that on Mumsnet, what you have is that there is this part of Mumsnet which is about conceiving and being pregnant and having a baby. And so, yes, you're going to get younger women on that part. But the great thing about Mumsnet, there are many other mothers and baby sites all over the world. And they really do have quite young demographics, because once you've had the baby, once you've made the nappy choice, once you've got over the teething and the feeding, then you move on. But the great thing is Mumsnet provides somewhere you move on to, so that while you're there talking about nappies, you also get to see that there are all these other parts of the site. And so it gives you a reason to stay there for, like me, 19, 20 years, because you can discuss all these other things. And certainly it's been a long time since I went on anything to do with childcare, because mine have gone. But there's still a lot there. So I think that's one of the beauties of Mumsnet, is it offers different things for different people. I come back to 10 million monthly users, lots and lots of different areas.
And that idea of, as you say, how Catholic the site is, and I'm very struck, and you make this point really forcibly in the book, that there just is no other comparable site anywhere in the world, which I was really taken aback by. We've got a question about that. Do you know if Mumsnet owns its own servers, and if so, how that was achieved? Do you think women owning our own servers would make a difference for free communication? Because there is a kind of autonomy, or it seems like, as an outsider, that there's an autonomy over Mumsnet.
I really don't know about the technical issues of Mumsnet. I've no idea about servers. What I do know is that they have stuck very, very closely to this idea of freedom of speech. It's a limited company with Justine Roberts as chief executive, and she was one of the original founders. And I think that, they're not stupid. Freedom of speech is a fantastic, unique selling point. They know that the feminism and women's rights boards bring people into the site. So it's not completely sort of without its calculation. But on the other hand, they have really stood up against some major attacks. They've lost major advertisers as well, so they've had a hit as far as their financial bottom line is concerned. But they really do believe that there should be this place for women to discuss within limits, and they do very, very carefully monitor and moderate the feminism and women's rights boards more than anything else. They don't go into style and beauty or am I being unreasonable in the same way as they moderate feminism and women's rights. But within that, it has become this place where women can talk about issues.
That's really interesting, and it relates to one of our other questions. And do please keep your questions coming. About this kind of moderation. And we've got a question asking, for understandable reasons, Mumsnet have tightened their talk rules on feminist boards. It can feel like censorship. Do you have any views on the extent to which this is shutting down women's ability to discuss key issues?
I know it feels like censorship, and women comment on that all the time, that they feel that they're being censored. But I think that they also acknowledge, and they often say this, that they acknowledge that Mumsnet has to do this because they're under such pressure.
What is it that they've done for those of us who are outsiders? Well, because I've heard this about the tightening up of regulations. So are there quite sort of clear, robust regulations now about
There's a lot of regulations which they have changed several times. So for example, they brought in that you are not allowed to dead name someone, in other words, name them by the name that they used to go to. Having said that, when they bring in, I think it's fascinating, they also brought in the rule that you were not allowed to use words like TERF and cis, that gender critical women object to. So they've tried to be even-handed. And they do, when you're reading a feminism and women's rights thread, the moderators are pulling things if people complain about it. And the problem is you're getting the impression those complaints are not coming from Mumsnetters themselves, they're coming from out with the board, particularly from Twitter. So yes, they are walking a really, really careful line between allowing free speech, but I call it a limited subaltern counterpublic because it is limited by this moderation, by this need to make sure that the site can keep going. So I noticed that the women who use the feminism boards, they themselves they have adapted their language, they have codes, they have ways of indicating things to people, and they often talk about, well, we can't say that, but you know what I mean. That kind of language is used a lot. So it is coded to a certain extent, but there is at all times a really general feeling that Mumsnet is doing its best in difficult circumstances.
That's really interesting. And you talked there about code and jargon, and I know a few people are sort of saying in the chat, oh, I've tried to get into it, but the jargon and the acronyms sort of puts me off. So here's a great question for those of us who are absolute Mumsnet beginners, because you can just explain to me what this means. Do you think Mumsnet's run-in with She Who Must Not Be Named influenced their stand on FWR board?
Yes.
I have no idea what that means.
Okay, quite early on in Mumsnet's life, there was a discussion about Gina Ford, who's a parenting guru, who's written several books, the Contented Little Baby books. And there was criticism of some of her approaches to childcare. There was quite a lot of robust, let's put it there, robust criticism. And Gina Ford said that she was going to take Mumsnet to court. And they finally settled for what is described in most newspapers as a 5-figure sum. And at a time when the site really wasn't making money. So this was a big thing. And this is one of the reasons why Mumsnet has become involved in the libel reform kind of pressure group. Something that Justine Roberts said, which I really like the way of describing. She says, we think of Mumsnet as a really big pub, and there are thousands of conversations going on. And yes, if something really gets out of line and there's violence or shouting and things, then we'll throw people out. But apart from that, we cannot moderate every single conversation going on in that pub. And they do post moderation, so they don't moderate you as you write. If there's a complaint about the post, then they come and have a look at it and then decide whether or not to moderate it. So they're involved in the Libel Reform Act. But yes, I think that they have always got in the back of their head that they ran into trouble quite early on. And so they are very careful with the FWR, Feminism and Women's Rights Board.
Okay. And following on from that, it sounds like you've got a good relationship with Mumsnet HQ, and you thought about the way that they moderate and so on. And one of our questioners asks, did you speak to any of the Mumsnet moderators while conducting your research, or was your research based solely on posters? And I guess as an addendum to that, can you tell us a bit about how Mumsnet goes about moderating? Do they nominate voluntary moderators, or is it sort of Mumsnet HQ who does it?
No, Mumsnet HQ employs at least over 100 staff, and some of those are employed as moderators throughout the night as well as during the day. It's a job. So that's how they go about it. So if there's a report, then they go and look at what's being reported. I didn't speak to moderators about this for this particular book. I have spoken to Mumsnet and visited Mumsnet HQ and whatever for other parts of my research, but not for this book. Yeah.
Is it glitzy, Mumsnet HQ?
I wouldn't say it's glitzy. It's just like any other sort of London headquarters of a media company.
I was just hoping that they'd just have loads of biscuits everywhere. Sarah's got this wonderful thing in her book about how politicians always ask, what's your favourite biscuit? So I kind of have this idea, that they're producing all these biscuits whenever you turn up. But
when I think about it, nobody offered me a biscuit when I went there. So no.
And another question relating to the gender debate. Do you know if Mumsnet have lost or gained users since that debate began? And if they've gained users, is there any way of telling whether that's due to the gender debate. And again, if I can sort of stick my oar in, I'd love to know when the gender debate began to appear on Mumsnet, if that's possible to track.
Well, Mumsnet originated the Feminism and Women's Rights Board in 2010. But even before that, I mean, one of the reasons that they did that was because there was a lot of discussion about feminism and women's rights, and there was a lot of demand for, can we have a place to do this? And that's why the topic appeared. I can't even remember the beginning of your question. What was the beginning?
Oh yeah, no problem. It was, do you think Mumsnet have lost or gained users since the debate began? Is it possible to track that?
I think they have gained, but I think what is interesting for them is that women now come into the site via the feminism and women's rights topic. So that's the way people are entering the site. And a couple of years ago, Mumsnet had a thread where they asked people, why do you use Mumsnet? And they had nearly 1,000 responses. And again, I read every single one of them and did an analysis of them. And 75% of those responses said, oh, it's because of the feminism or because of the women's rights discussion. You know, mostly people are saying it's because it's entertaining, because I love, am I being unusual, unreasonable? But again and again, people were saying, but yes, for the feminism.
That's amazing. I mean, that relates to another one of our questions, which is, do you think that the feminist ethos from the Feminism and Women's Rights Board extends to the relationships board and the support that women receive in understanding their relationships with men in feminist terms? And the questioner says, I'm particularly thinking of the Mumsnet acronym LTB, Leave the Bastard.
Yeah, absolutely. It really does. And it's everywhere, from people talking about when they were reading fairy tales to their children, that they switch the genders. It's people talking about films and whether or not they pass the Bechdel test. But it really is, particularly on the relationships board, there is a really strong support for women who are suffering from things like domestic violence, coercive control, and you know, these things are named, and really, really good advice is given to them. But it's also on things like if somebody is complaining about, you know, a husband complaining that she's not keeping the house tidy, then there is an immediate sort of, well, what's he bloody doing about it? And you know, that so I think feminism, whether, you know, feminist light kind of attitude towards relationships, the family, your work environment, it does pervade Mumsnet, yes.
I get a sort of question that follows on from that is, does their feminism translate sort of offline? You know, are there cases of, well, I talk about some in the book, really, cases of women beginning to organise as groups on Mumsnet and then taking part in feminist action or coming to Women's Place UK meetings or doing other kind of things?
Yeah, I mean, this is why I talk about this symbiotic relationship, because what you get on Mumsnet during events like a Women's Place UK speech or event or whatever is you get reporters from the field. You know, I'm in the third row. Is there anybody else here? Oh yes, I'm in the purple hat behind you. And then, okay, you know, Selina Todd has stood up. This is what she's saying. And so there's this constant reporting from all of these events. But then there's also the sort of the action I talk about. So I talk about Man Friday, for example, where you get this group of Mumsnetters who set out to prove to Swim England that the new policies they brought in are not workable because of the potential of self-ID. And so they go out and they identify as men and turn up, I think it was a Dulwich swimming pool, turn up dressed in men's trunks and say, we want to go in the men only swimming class now. And when there's a fuss, they sort of go, but this is, you know, you've adopted this principle of self-ID. Didn't you realize this might happen? And then that moves on to sort of wider action. So yes, there's both actual physical action, but there's also a lot of, okay, we all need to write a letter here or sign this petition or you know, go on Facebook and show our support for.
That's brilliant. Wow, it's so wide-ranging. That's incredible. And you spoke about the impact that some of that has had on Mumsnet. You said that they've lost advertising revenue through it. We've got a specific question about big sponsors and whether it's true that Flora stopped sponsoring Mumsnet because of the issue, the Gender Recognition Act issue and the debate around that, and whether it's put off other big sponsors?
It's very difficult because Mumsnet obviously doesn't go around saying, oh yes, we've lost another sponsor because of it. But yes, the rumors in the financial press is that 2 or 3 other sponsors have pulled out. But it's not just sponsors. For example, in May, the GMB union, the trade union, was supposed to be going onto Mumsnet to run a series of classes, I suppose, about women's employment rights during COVID, which obviously would have been really, really useful. And they were denounced on Twitter. You can't go on that transphobic site. And GMB pulled out and said, well, we're not doing it anymore. And that's happened with several other sort of big charities and organizations who have wanted to come and do something on Mumsnet, have announced they're going to do it, and then have been sort of shamed into pulling out. So yes, it's sponsors, but it's also other actions that have stopped.
That's really interesting. Is there any sort of sense of that happening the other way? You know, you mentioned about Mumsnetters writing letters and contributing to petitions and so on. Have they ever managed to have any kind of noticeable pushback in terms of policy or, you know, advertisers or whatever? And I guess I'm thinking also about, you know, the recent kind of government announcement that actually following the GRA consultation, they're not going to change the law. I wonder if you think Mumsnet played a part in that.
Yes, I absolutely do. I think that you know, even just the politicians that saw the strength of feeling on Mumsnet, I think that really did play a part in it. Helen Joyce, the journalist, she ran a thread on Twitter a couple of weeks ago where she said, why do people think that this has happened in the UK? And again, I'd say about 70% of the tweets, she had about 300 people responding, and about 70% at one point or the other said Mumsnet. But Mumsnet, I mean, even before that came up in 2010, in January 2010, there was a campaign by the Outdoor Advertising Authority. They wanted to show people that despite the internet, it was still worth spending money on outdoor, you know, big posters. And they hired a company, a publicity company, to put together a campaign. And the campaign was, we're going to put up a poster that says something, you know, controversial. And there'll also be a website link, and you could go on this website and debate this controversial thing. And one of the first posters they put up in London said, career women make bad mothers. And the outcry of anger on Mumsnet was immediate and very violent. But these women, they immediately organized, and you got a flood of letters going to the outdoor agency, but also any company that worked with the outdoor advertising agency, any company that worked with this publicity company. And the publicity company admitted afterwards they'd been taken off pitches because the companies they were trying to pitch to had just received all these letters from Mumsnetters. Within 24 hours, those posters were down. And instead, they worked with Mumsnet to produce another poster that says something like sexist adverts are shocking or something. But, you know, bizarrely, it really did prove that that to the outdoor advertising agency, that posters could immediately get a lot of people talking about them on the internet. So in a way, it kind of proved the campaign. But yeah, no, that was sort of immediate, and that was back in 2010.
Gosh, that's incredible. And sometimes it takes a few years, doesn't it, to track the influence of something. So maybe we'll be having that discussion in 5 years, you know, for the sequel, the new edition, or, you know, the revised edition. Right, another question. One that relates to what you were saying about GMB and so on. Is Mumsnet HQ unionised?
I do not know. I'm sorry, I do not know.
All right, next book. That's absolutely fine. You can't do everything in one book. And then somebody's asked, oh yeah, and I've heard about this. So they've asked, does the book have any insight into some of the codes used by Mumsnetters when they're trying to avoid disruptors and fly under the radar? I can report that yes, it does. And I think, you know, particularly since you've told us, you know, you're an insider, you do that really clearly and really well. One of the ones that this questioner highlights is Bunbury. And I wonder, could you say something about Bunbury? Because I know some people have mentioned it in the chat as well.
Not to a great extent. I mean, I think Yeah, it is. It's just all these codes and ways of talking about things. Mumsnet are really clever, you know, and so you get these things, and that the ways in which you can talk about things, like she who must not be named. If we go back to Gina Ford, because Justine Roberts went on and she said, look, we've had to settle this out of court action, and please do not talk about Gina Ford anymore. And she, you know, she immediately became she who must not be named, or SW, whatever it is. And so there are all these ways that they use to sort of continue talking about things, but in ways that stick within the guidelines.
That's really interesting. It sounds from what you're saying that the women who use Mumsnet have quite a lot of loyalty to it, but also a critical relationship with it. You know, I'm thinking about, I read something in the new magazine, The Radical Notion, absolutely great read if you've not got it, about the subreddit that existed on feminism, particularly gender critical feminism. And there it sounded very much like the women who were involved were sort of felt all the time that they were against Reddit, you know, that they were doing it absolutely against the stream of where Reddit was going. Whereas it sounds like you're describing a community of, thinking about the feminists on Mumsnet, a community of feminists who have different views, might sometimes be fed up at the way that Mumsnet is trying to moderate freedom of speech and so on, but on the whole are quite satisfied with the site, think they're getting from it what they want. Would that be fair?
I think I would describe them as appreciative but critical.
Right.
Yeah, they are aware, and particularly, you know, a couple of years ago when things were really sort of batting down the hatches, they're very aware that Mumsnet was sticking its neck out for them, that, you know, had created this place that no one else would create for them. But at the same time, they are critical of, you know, the moderation that goes on, what they are and are not allowed to speak about. Yeah, they are still critical of that. They don't want to be censored in the way they are.
It just sounds like such a healthy debate, given that, you know, you and I both work on the history of feminism, and we know that there's a kind of pat, lazy narrative about, oh, well, in the end, feminists just always fall out, you know, because they're women, and, you know, that's why these waves come to an end. And there's a modicum of truth in that, I think, about how people receive and deal with criticism. But you're presenting us with a kind of, it sounds like a very sort of healthy democratic debate that's going on Mumsnet.
Yeah, I mean, again, the word robust is probably the one I would use. It's not always, not everybody plays nicely, but, you know, it is, you'll always learn something when you go on. It's informed by research, it's informed by enthusiasm, and also by people's personal experience.
It's really interesting. Right, a few more questions from our wonderful audience. Was the Feminism and Women's Rights Board so heavily dominated by any other single issue prior to the current debate about GRA reform?
No, I mean, the GRA reform has dominated the threads in a way that I can't think of anything else. No, that's the simple answer. I mean, there is discussion that goes on about other stuff, whether it's coercive control or, you know, the Fawcett Society and Stella Creasy had a bill going through Parliament a couple of weeks ago. There was discussion about that. I mean, there is discussion about other things, but it is at the moment probably the most dominant theme.
Yeah, it makes sense. And related to that, one questioner asks, is there any kind of discussion of prostitution versus sex work on Mumsnet?
Yes, there definitely is, and that's, yeah, I've seen it be more dominant at different times, but yes, at the moment there's a lot of discussion about, is it Holbeck, the place in Leeds? There's sort of always somebody talking about that. So yes, that's, I mean, it is feminism and women's rights. There's a whole variety of things that are discussed.
It's really interesting. And do you think, another question, do you think that Mumsnet, particularly on feminism and women's rights, speaks to women of colour, and does it matter if that's not happening?
There's been a big debate on Mumsnet quite recently, and in fact Mumsnet has set up now a sort of an area of Mumsnet for women of colour that they were asked to do. I mean, most of the places that are set up, whether it's that or the Feminism and Women's Rights, or the space for dog lovers or Scotsnet, comes because Mumsnetters say, we want this place. We want a place for just us to speak about each other. And the site responds or doesn't respond. So there's a place you can talk about Brexit, for example. So yeah, it is. I mean, I think one of the key strengths, and we haven't really talked about it on Mumsnet, is the fact that you're anonymous on it, that you choose a pen name. And I think, from my own research about women writing in the 1900s, it's incredibly important to be anonymous if you're going to take this step of stepping into the public sphere and talking about politics. And for women in the 1900s, that was because their families and their friends would be absolutely shocked, perhaps, with their support for the suffragettes. And now it actually can be career limiting to be talking about things like the GRA. So that's, I think, the major strength of Mumsnet, is that you are anonymous. So actually, I don't know, unless somebody says, I'm a woman of colour, or I'm from Scotland. You don't know about anybody, and you can change your name all the time, and people have names or change their names to names that have a message in them themselves. So I do think that the anonymity that Mumsnet offers, unlike somewhere like Facebook, for example, is key to women being able to have these conversations.
Yeah, that's really striking. I've noticed that at Women's Place meetings. I've got a very close friend who's an assiduous Mumsnetter, and that whole thing of meeting up and going, oh, I'm so and so, and all that. But she changes her name every week, I think. So she's always like, oh, yeah, I can't remember who I am at the moment. Someone asks, is there room in your book to discuss the nastier or more negative side of Mumsnet, the bullying or women policing each other, or just mutually raising each other's anxiety about parenting? Which, I hold my hands up. I think before reading your book was not necessarily my sense of what Mumsnet was, but was probably most of what I'd heard about Mumsnet was the kind of sense of sort of, very much yummy mummies ramping up pressure about doing parenting in particular kinds of middle class ways.
I don't discuss it in the book because the book's really focused on politics. I've discussed it elsewhere in some of the articles and book chapters I've written about Mumsnet, about kind of almost performative motherhooding, and in particular, sorry to bring class back into it, but the middle class concept of motherhood or parenting as a project that you work hard at, and you make sure that your child goes to the right schools and wears the right clothes and has the right friends. And you do see that on Mumsnet, this concept of motherhood as being this big project that women have to throw themselves into in order to give their children the best. There isn't so much sort of laissez-faire, they'll grow up or they'll grow up. So yeah, I've written about it elsewhere, but not in this book.
Great. So you've just got to check out more and more Sarah's writing. I totally recommend that, actually. Another question, does the book look at the political and philosophical education that the posters on Mumsnet provide to others? And the questioner says that she got the Chesterton's fence principle from Mumsnet.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is the amazing thing about Mumsnet, that you can get this whole education about all sorts of things, from Mumsnetters, and people are very happy to explain things or post you off to go and have a look at something, either another thread on Mumsnet or elsewhere on the internet. People will explain things to you. So yeah, there's the education that goes on, or the sharing of information is actually, I think, how I prefer to be talking about it, because there's not the I'm the expert on this and you are sort of a student, but there's a real sense of, oh, if you don't know about this, let me help you understand a bit more, or why don't you go and read this, you might find it helpful. So yeah, no, you can get education on all sorts of things on Mumsnet.
That's amazing. And that relates to another question that we've got, which I know that you do talk about in the book. Someone's asked, what do you think about the long-running Westminster Enders and Trump threads?
Oh, well, I have also written about those both in the book and elsewhere. And these are where I've come up with this concept of citizen curation. The Trump threads in particular, I've written about, and about the way in which women bring all these sources of information and discuss them. But it's citizen journalism is supposed to be journalism that's subjective, you know, that you have a passion about something and you're going to write about it, and it doesn't matter, you know, you're only interested in your particular take on it. And to a certain extent, I think that happens on places like the Trump threads, where they're definitely not pro-Trump, let's put it that way. And so they celebrate sources of information that are also anti-Trump. And that means that sources that normally get short shrift on Mumsnet, say, for example, the Daily Mail, if the Daily Mail runs an article that is antagonistic to Trump, then it's almost prized even higher than a left-wing source, because it is, oh look, that even the Daily Mail is saying this about Trump. So I'm fascinated by that. But yeah, I'm looking at the moment at the threads about the coronavirus, and one thing I haven't really said much about in the book, but it's something I'm talking about in what I'm writing at the moment, is that Mumsnet is also a place where women can express anger. And it's one of the only places that women, particularly mothers, are allowed to be angry. And the coronavirus threads, there is anger at the government, at the media, but also at, you know, members of their household or their parents or whatever. And I think it's a great place where you can go and express this, particularly in lockdown, where you might have it all sort of inside you, and you know, you don't want to be sort of letting it out in your own household. But Mumsnet, you can go and be angry, and that's something women aren't really allowed to be.
Oh gosh, yeah, isn't that the truth? Yeah, that's amazing. One of our questions actually talks about the effect that being on Mumsnet has had on them, and says, I've felt empowered to join online and real life feminist action since reading Mumsnet, and would like to know whether there's been a personal impact on you, both since seeing this on you both since seeing this grassroots feminism emerging again. So do you want to go first, since you're the author?
Yes, it has had a major impact on me in several ways. So I spoke in Edinburgh, for example, with Lucy and Julie Bindel. I was there. So I've kind of, at Edinburgh, I said, I spend a lot of time researching the suffragists and the suffragettes, and I go to give talks about them. And people always ask, do you think you'd be a suffragette or a suffragist? And I always say, oh, I'd have been a suffragist. I'd have written letters perhaps and sort of said, oh, you know, rights for women, but that's all I'd have done. And this, however, now I feel like I'm sort of channeling my inner suffragette. So it has really changed me in that way. And then the other way that Mumsnet's really changed me is reading about people's experiences of things like domestic violence and coercive control has meant that I have become involved with my local women's aid group, and I'm now on the board of directors there. So those are the two sort of impacts that Mumsnet has had on me recently.
Wow, that's just incredible. I guess I would say, as someone who's not a Mumsnet, yeah, I think that the growth of grassroots feminism has just been incredible. Kiri Tunks put something on Twitter earlier about the kind of friendship and solidarity that is created, and I sort of acknowledge that by saying, yeah, and Women's Place UK has been such a big part of that. I think many of us have lost friends or networks that we previously had before becoming so involved, but they've been richly replaced, you know, for me, by women in and around WP UK. And I think one of the things about reading the book was thinking, wow, that's really happening with Mumsnet as well, which is, it's just incredible, when, you know, we know that so many women have been isolated as feminists for a long time. And also, and I think you've brought this out today, Sarah, in what you said, one of the things that really heartened me reading the book, and I was reading it and The Radical Notion sort of, you know, side by side, is the growth in debate about feminism. Because I don't know what your experience has been, but my experience in academic life has been that feminism hasn't really been on the agenda, or it's been a certain kind of liberal feminism that's been on the agenda. So I've not been having the kinds of debates that, you know, Mumsnetters and writers in The Radical Notion or speakers at WPUK having, really, where we all begin within sort of feminist parameters, but then, as you point out in the book, you know, can have a really good ding dong about various issues and really get into depth with them.
Yeah. I mean, definitely. I would say that I think that in general, British society is feminism, or feminism light, is having a bit of a moment. And there's sort of, you know, Beyonce and, you know, politicians wearing t-shirts saying this is what a feminist looks like and everything. So it has become detoxified. The whole concept of feminism has been detoxified from, say, 10, 15 years ago, when, you know, it was, oh my God, you know, nobody would admit that. Most of my students now will say they're a feminist, although when we start actually having a conversation about what they mean by that, it's not necessarily what I mean by it, but it is a word that is more embraced these days. But yeah, no, to have these conversations, Mumsnet is an absolutely fantastic place. And probably sort of at my work, you know, I'm, oh God, it's her again. She's going to sort of demand that we talk about female before male in the listings or whatever. So I'm still the token, as it were. But it's great to go somewhere where it is just a generally accepted principle.
That's really great. Well, I'm going to ask a couple of very final, quick fire, completely Mumsnet related questions. Firstly, what is your favourite board?
Well, the feminism and women's rights, but I love Am I Being Unreasonable? It's just brilliant. And I love a good car parking thread.
What's a car parking thread?
Oh, it's a thread where someone with diagrams points out that their neighbour is parking in a very inconsiderate way.
Wow, I think that's probably all my neighbours. I'm a really rubbish car parker. It's not men. It's not men. And then finally, do you post on the boards yourself, Sarah, or are you a lurker?
I'm mostly a lurker, but I do post. Probably not as frequently as I would like, but I do post, yeah. I'm even in one of the, because Mumsnet has got a series of books out where they quote from people who've been on Mumsnet, and it's one of my claims to fame that I am in one of those books.
That's great. That's fantastic. Well, this has been an absolute education, and I can't emphasize enough, Sarah has talked so stimulatingly about so many different aspects of Mumsnet over the last hour, and thank you for talking and ranging so widely. But so much of this is also explored in the book at greater length, and with also, of course, the wonderful Mumsnet pseudonyms, including Penis Beaker. Sarah is the only person who has Penis Beaker in her book index, to my knowledge. So it's really worth buying. Just a reminder again, it's in the links. But finally, just a massive virtual round of applause for Sarah. And honestly, if you're looking for Christmas presents, this is the book for the feminist in your life, or the person who you want to convert to feminism, because it also makes Mumsnet sound like a huge amount of stimulating fun, as the last hour has been. So thank you all for attending, and particular thanks to you, Sarah, and good evening, everybody.